All right, so this is batch continuous time trajectory estimation as exactly sparse Gaussian process regression. My name is Tim Barfoot. This is work I did with Tong and Simo Sarkka. So imagine you have something like the Google car, and as it moves through the world, it's gathering a bunch of sensor data at a number of discrete times. We're typically interested in estimating the trajectory of this vehicle at those measurement times. But additionally, we might be interested in querying the underlying continuous time trajectory at a number of additional query times. So for example, you might have some GPS data from which you're estimating the trajectory, and then you later might want to know where the vehicle was as it gathered a bunch of laser data. So this is exactly what was done in this well-known paper by the Oxford group, where they estimated motion from stereo cameras and then later went back to figure out where the vehicle was as it gathered a large number of laser dots, and so that they could know where the vehicle was and build these really beautiful 3D models. And if you were estimating motion from cameras, you might introduce some landmarks, and the observations of these landmarks are represented by these red lines. And the red dots are factors, which we can think of as a squared error term in some overall objective function that we're trying to minimize. And there's a bit of a problem here. So we call this a factor graph. There's a bit of a problem, which we see here, that the query time is not particularly well constrained with respect to the rest of the factor graph. So we would need to introduce some kind of ad hoc interpolation scheme to try and figure out where it is with respect to the rest of the variables. And the situation gets much, much worse when we start thinking about things like rolling shutter cameras or scanning laser rangefinders, because then we don't actually observe any two landmarks at the same time, and we have to introduce more variables. And we see the underlying factor graph is even less well constrained than it was before. So let's go back to the simpler case of just estimating motion with GPS, which we can represent using these unary factors. And then to really constrain the problem and actually simultaneously smooth the solution, what we can do is introduce a Gaussian process prior, or a motion model. And this is something we introduced in this IJRR paper from last year. And the problem with that paper is that the GPs that we considered were actually very, very general. So if you consider something like the squared exponential function, what you end up with is constraints between all of the pose variables, which becomes very, very expensive to solve. So what we consider in this paper is a subset of priors. In fact, ones that are very, very nicely sparse, and so we can very, very efficiently solve these systems. And the question is, where do these priors come from? So we borrow ideas going way, way back to the 1960s, where we start with linear time-varying stochastic differential equations. And I note here that the state that we're talking about needs to be Markov. So the state x is Markov. The system needs to be driven by a zero-mean white noise. And if we integrate one of these functions in closed form so that we get a continuous time prior, this is now a GP that we can use to do regression. And then all of these equations actually result in an inverse kernel matrix that's exactly sparse. And that's where we get this really nice sparse factor graph, and that's how we can solve the system very, very efficiently. So just as an example of one of those priors, we can consider something like white noise on acceleration, which is sometimes called the constant velocity model. And we note that we need to recast it in this first order form where we have a new state x that's both position and velocity to exploit this very, very nice sparsity. And if we do that, then we end up with a factor graph kind of like the one that I was showing you before. It looks like this. And we can actually go one step further. By viewing this as Gaussian process regression, we get this really nice separation principle. So it turns out that you can actually solve for the trajectory at all of the measurement times, and then later go back and look at all of the query times. And you only need to consider two of the measurement times in order to figure out the query times. So we can do this very, very efficiently. We can actually do it in linear time in the number of pose variables, except in the case of landmarks. The really, really cool thing is that the choice of the prior actually defines the interpolation scheme that we use to figure out where the query times are. So we don't need to pick that ad hocly. It just comes for free by viewing this as regression. In the case of landmarks, everything is still nicely well constrained, kind of like this picture, so we can still solve very efficiently, and the separation principle still applies. We consider a really simple example in the paper of a robot moving through a forest of landmarks, and we're simultaneously estimating its trajectory as well as the position of all the landmarks. And I note that we're using the white noise on acceleration prior, so the trajectory is both position and velocity. So we get very nice smooth answers. We query at lots of intermediate times. And something that used to take 20 minutes when we didn't exploit sparsity, we can now sort of do in 8 seconds. So this has been batch continuous time trajectory estimation as exactly sparse Gaussian process regression. And I hope to see you at the interactive presentations later today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Held, and I would like to present combining 3D shape, color, and motion for robust anytime tracking. This is joint work with Jesse Levinson, Sebastian Thrun, and Silvio Savarese from Stanford University. The main goal of this project is to quickly and robustly estimate the velocity of moving objects. This is important for autonomous driving and other outdoor robotic applications. For example, when driving down a narrow lane, we want to be able to estimate if any of the cars parked on the side is trying to pull out into the lane. This is also important when merging onto a highway or when changing lanes on a busy street. We also want to detect if this bicyclist is about to swerve into traffic or to estimate what this pedestrian is doing. The input to our system is a stream of camera images and laser data. We rely on previous work for segmentation and data association, and the goal of this project is to estimate the velocity of moving objects. At each frame, we sample a set of points from the surface of the tracked object. Given the set of points observed at the previous frame and the points observed at the current frame, we want to estimate the velocity of this object. The simplest method to do this is to compute the centroids from the two sets of points, and then to measure the displacement of the centroid. However, due to occlusions and viewpoint changes, the motion of the centroid can differ from the actual motion of the tracked object. Another method to perform alignment is ICP, which, starting from some initialization, iteratively improves the alignment until convergence. However, because ICP performs a local search, it can easily get stuck in a poor local optimum. Our approach is to compute the probability of a number of different alignments. For each alignment that we want to compute the probability of, we iterate over all points in the current frame, and for each point, we find its nearest neighbor in the previous frame. We then compute the probability of this match using the spatial distance, the color distance if color is available, and the probability of occlusion. We thus have a coherent probabilistic framework for combining 3D shape, color, and motion for improved tracking accuracy. Here we have computed the probability of each of these alignments, and the alignment on the top right has the highest probability. Now that we have a method for computing the probability of different alignments, how do we sample from the space of alignments? If we densely sample from the space, our method would be too slow. So instead we start by coarsely sampling from the space of alignments. We then sample more finely in regions of high probability. This method is derived from minimizing the KL divergence between the approximate distribution and the true posterior. To make this method work, when we initially coarsely sample, we must inflate the measurement model. As we sample more finely, we anneal the measurement model until we are sampling from the true distribution. As we allow our method to run for longer, it becomes increasingly accurate. We then have a trade-off between runtime and accuracy that we can tune based on the total runtime requirements and the importance of each tracked object. We evaluate on 500 tracked objects, and the y-axis here is the error, so lower is better. Here we see the performance of the baseline Kalman filter, which is very fast, but it's not very accurate. Here we see 3 different ICP methods with different initializations. Our method, shown in blue, is more accurate than the previous methods while still running in real time. Here we've used the Kalman filter baseline to estimate the velocity of 5 parked cars that are shown in red. The estimated velocity vectors are shown in blue, and the Kalman filter has incorrectly estimated that 2 of these cars are moving. Our tracker has correctly computed that all of these cars are stationary. Here we see a bicyclist that we are tracking as it bikes around this curve. Using the velocity estimates produced by our tracker, we can build a color object model of this bicyclist as it bikes by. The model built using our tracker in the center is clearly cleaner than the model built using the baseline method shown on the right. Here we see some other object models that are built using the velocity estimates from our tracker. For each of these models, we can compute a score that measures how crisp the model is. Here we see that our tracker produces crisper models than those computed by the baselines when evaluated on people, bikes, and moving cars, thus demonstrating that our tracker generalizes across object types. In conclusion, by combining 3D shape, color, and motion, our tracker is robust to occlusions and viewpoint changes. Using annealed dynamic histograms, we can make our tracker run in real time while being robust to initialization errors. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matthew Gombolay. I work with Professor Julia Shah in the Interactive Robotics Group at MIT. Advances in robotic technology are opening up the possibility of integrating autonomous robotic teammates into the workspace where currently most of the work is done by people. Last year at RSS, we presented Tercio, an autonomous scheduling algorithm able to coordinate human-robot teams in time and safety critical domains such as manufacturing. In an example scenario, our algorithm schedules a set of robots to complete a set of tasks to build an airplane fuselage, and a human supervisor needs to enter the space, and then our algorithm is able to automatically adapt to ensure that production deadlines are guaranteed and ensure the safety of the worker. Where our algorithm can coordinate these human-robot teams, that does not mean that the technology will be adopted. Instead, taking away control from human workers and giving that to the automation may create resistance to the technology and ultimately may not be adopted. Thus, we need to understand how do we integrate autonomous robots into the workforce considering resistance to automation. We envision a scenario where a set of humans and robots work together to complete a set of manufacturing tasks. In terms of team efficiency, we hypothesized that the team would be most efficient when the robots had more control over scheduling decisions. In terms of the worker's desire to work with their robotic counterparts, we envision that humans would prefer sharing control. Giving too much control to the robot would make the worker feel devalued, and giving too much control to the human would be too burdensome. Thus, we expected to find a sweet spot in the middle to maximize efficiency and worker satisfaction when control was shared. We invited 24 participants to work on a manufacturing team with an additional human and a robot. In our scenario, there were two types of tasks, fetching and assembling parts kits. There were 2 locations to fetch and 2 locations to assemble those parts kits. No 2 workers could be working at the same location at the same time to adhere to safety standards. Analogous to manufacturing, fetching a parts bin consisted of verifying that the correct parts were in the bin and bringing the bin to the assembly area. Assembling a parts kit consisted of actually putting together the Lego pieces. Each member of the team had a unique capability. The human and robotic teammates could fetch parts bins while only the human workers could assemble the parts bins. We varied the level of control over 3 conditions. First, in the manual condition, the human would decide who would perform which tasks on the team. In the autonomous condition, the robot would allocate the tasks, and in the semi-autonomous condition, the human would decide which tasks that he or she wanted to perform, and the robot would determine how to allocate the rest of the tasks among the teammates. We were able to confirm that both time to generate a schedule for the team or allocate the tasks and time to execute that schedule was faster when the robot had more control in the autonomous condition. In terms of the human-robot relationship and the desire of the human worker to work with the robot, we found that workers preferred working with the robot that had more control over scheduling decisions, especially in terms of the robot was more intelligent, the robot better perceived the goal of the human worker, and that the work would rather work with the autonomous robot again in the future. We also we visited our hypothesis. So rather than finding a sweet spot where the control was shared, what we actually found is that both worker satisfaction and efficiency was maximized when the autonomous robot had full control. We also investigated how people are making these decisions. So to be an efficient team, I might rely on somebody else to finish a prerequisite task so that then I can finish my own task. But however, achieving this choreography can be difficult. So I may choose to isolate my work from the rest of the team and work independently. What we see here is a measure of the frequency with which people chose tasks that did not rely on a team member finishing a prerequisite task. And in a condition where people had limited control over scheduling decisions, they tended to isolate themselves or make themselves independent from the rest of the team. At the beginning of this talk, I posed a question: how do we integrate robots into the workspace considering resistance to automation? And what we found through our experimental investigation is quite a strong case that we should be automating this process both in terms of efficiency and the desire of the human worker to utilize their robotic technology. It's important to note that our sample population was not real factory workers, and it's important to continue working to test and vet our findings in real factories. But we believe this is a strong case for this in our experimental findings. So I encourage you to come talk to me during the poster session at 3:30 today. Thank you very much.
So, my name is Luca Fiorio, and today I'm going to talk to you about Stiction compensation in Agonist-Antagonist variable stiffness actuators. Before talking about Stiction, let me introduce the actuator and its main property that is called passive noise rejection. So why are we interested in passive noise rejection? Because we think that highly relying on feedback in artificial agents such as for example, a humanoid robot, might not be a viable strategy, especially considering the high amount of sensor that needs to be continuously acquired and processed to complete complex actions. So in this sense, passive noise rejection can be achieved by implementing part of the control loop at the mechanical level. So what we say is that basically the feedback can be implemented mechanically in the geometry of the system. We already have some really nice example of system that performs really complex tasks such as walking or running with very little control. So our question was, can we bring these concepts from the high-level tasks really to the low level, so to the actuator side? Because we know that humans and animals, although are really slow in feedback, can perform really complex tasks in really noisy environments really easily. And what came out from this idea was a new actuator design based on agonist-antagonist configuration. And as you can see, this actuator is composed with 4 non-linear springs. And the key element of these actuators is that you can always find a closed path that connects the actuator output joint to the actuator frame. And by co-contracting the agonist and the antagonist side of the actuator, we can increase the stiffness of this path, and eventually we can increase this passive noise rejection capability of the system. So for a given set of internal actuation torque, the actuator possesses a unique equilibrium position of the output joint. But actually, due to the configuration, and in particular due to the agonist and antagonist configuration of the system, by co-contracting the agonist and antagonist side, we increase the internal forces in the system. And in particular, what happens is that the stiction at the gear levels propagates through the system up to the output joint, where it gives rise to a set of an indifferent equilibrium configuration that basically we named deadband. And the problem that we faced and that we are trying to solve in this paper is that by augmenting the level of co-contraction, the deadband increases really rapidly. So our question was, can we mechanically, so again passively, so as you can see here, for low level of co-contraction, the deadband is already present, and increasing the level of co-contraction, the deadband increases really fast, and the actuator becomes basically not usable. And our question was, can we mechanically, and so again passively, somehow compensate and reverse this behavior of the deadband? Because we already know that we have some mechanical elements, that, basically some springs that we can exploit somehow to reverse the behavior of the deadband, such that increasing the level of co-contraction, the deadband decreases instead of increasing. And what we did basically was to analytically describe the deadband as a function of the actuator co-contraction, and using this analytical description of the deadband, we have been able to derive an analytical condition over the spring potential energies, such that basically increasing the level of co-contraction, the increase of the restoring force is faster than the increase of the stiction components inside of the actuator. And by solving this analytical condition, we derived the new potential energies equation, and by optimizing those equations for our current actuator, we achieved a reversing effect. We reversed the effect of the deadband. So now for a low level of co-contraction, the system presents actually a larger deadband, but so as you can see, this is again the same low level of co-contraction as before, but by increasing the level of co-contraction, now the system deadband decreases pretty fast. Actually, we didn't achieve cancellation of the deadband because we still have some constraint of the whole hardware, but now we are working on a new actuator design that should fully exploit this methodology to cancel the deadband of the actuator. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Siddharth from Carnegie Mellon. I'm going to talk about simultaneous compliance registration estimation for robotic surgery, and this is work in collaboration with Nabil Saman at Vanderbilt. So the problem that we're trying to address with this work is surgeons face limited situational awareness in minimally invasive surgery, and that's because of the loss of visualization. You don't have a bird's eye view, and there's loss of tactile perception as well. And this problem is exaggerated when you have articulated structures or mechanisms that are moving inside the body. So the idea is we can estimate a model of the environment and provide a visualization like the one that you see on the screen. And this is the HARP robot moving around a heart. And if you can estimate the model, you can provide this bird's eye visualization. A key ingredient here is that you need a registration between the robot and the surface. And a lot of people work on this problem. The thing that distinguishes our work is that we are trying to solve the registration problem for flexible environments, and we're using palpation so we're palpating the environment to figure out what the registration between the robot and the surface is. And a key insight in our work is that we need to solve two coupled problems to solve this problem. That is, we need to estimate the registration and the map stiffness simultaneously. So because there are coupled problems, we solve the registration and stiffness mapping simultaneously. We do this by palpating the object at multiple force levels. And as we palpate the object, we measure the contact force and use it in a probabilistic filter to minimize the forces that we observe and we predict. So once again, an overview, what we have as an input to our filtering algorithm is the geometric constraints that we have from a prior surface model, which we get from a scan. And what we get from the robot is the tip position and contact forces. And we input this to our filtering algorithm, and we get the robot registration and the normal stiffness at every point on the map. So the first test case is a planar surface with two stiff inclusions. And in a moment, you'll see an animation of, as the robot is palpating, the right side of the surface is what is inside the surface. And as the robot palpates the surface, it has its, the green points are the points where it thinks the points are from its initial estimate of its registration. As it updates its estimate, the points move inside so that the contact forces that it's expecting match the ones that it observes. So in the top right, you can see the estimate improves as the palpation proceeds along, and it especially goes down once you start palpating at the second force level. The second case is a 3D pyramid with stiff inclusions. This is the IREP at Vanderbilt palpating the object, and what we're measuring, the spherical probe at the end has a magnetic tracker, and we're also measuring contact forces via the load cells that are connected to the secondary backbones of the system. And as this, now this is the filter updating where it thinks the contact points should be. So it's updating where it thinks the robot should be with respect to the surface to minimize the residual forces on the surface. The plots show the registration estimate as the filter runs, and it goes down, and that's always good. And this is on the left is the ground truth stiffness of the object. On the right is the estimated stiffness distribution once the filter runs through all the data. And qualitatively, at least, they look fairly similar. So to conclude, what we've done in this paper is we've developed a framework to simultaneously estimate the stiffness and the registration. And we do this and we're able to palpate the environment and do this on the fly. And a key feature is that we're leveraging non-visual features. So we're not using just geometric features, but we're using force features as well. And this can be used for finding stiffness maps, and I'll end there. Thank you.
So we now have a QA time.
So for A2, what about tracking objects that are further away? Because the performance, you need to be close to objects to get such good performance, but the further away,
Yeah, great question. I can show you a session and show the accuracy of the distance, and definitely performance does degrade along the distance, but it's still better than the baseline methods at all distances. And we also incorporate the sensor resolution as part of our model. So we
Okay.
For the stiction compensation, do you consider using passive and dynamic, or not dynamic, but reactive or control-based methods for eliminating the stiction zone?
Yeah, basically, we thought also about using some control method to compensate for the stiction, but our idea was we want to keep it passively. So the system is designed to be controlled like open loop. So for a given set of internal actuation torque, the system has only one equilibrium position and only one stiffness at the joint. And we wanted to keep on basically develop the system such that can be controlled open loop. So we wanted to compensate the stiction mechanically without using any control. Thank you for the question.
Yes. So, for manufacturing human trials, I wonder if we could gain a lot more information and insight by first training the operator in the task prior to introducing the automation, so they get something more realistic, where we have introduced an automation to a task that is already being performed by a human, so they have some expertise and knowledge of what's being done and how to do it.
Certainly. So your question would be, can we see some benefit in the more, when the humans have more control if they go through some proper training? Is that the question?
Yeah, should we train, when we do experiments like this, should we train them without the automation first? Here's how to assemble the Lego, here's the tasks that need to be done. And then later introduce the automation and see if their reaction is different, because at that point they're now an expert user.
So to answer that question first, we did train our users on how to perform each of the tasks and the constraints of the scenario. However, building up that experience in a laboratory setting is difficult. It's something more of a longitudinal study before you introduce the automation. The second fold is that in our lab, we just finished conducting an experiment with just a human team as our baseline to see, how are people viewing the robots differently than maybe a human teammate having control. So I think that'll be very important. I'm excited to analyze the data. And lastly, I think human factors shows strongly that the first impression is incredibly important, and that if you enter a robot into the space, that the perception that the person have is going to be anchored. And even if you improve the robot a lot, that you're going to be stuck at wherever you introduce the robot. So it's very important to consider how much control the robot should have when it enters the space on that first time. Even if there is training you can do later, it may not be able to overcome that first impression.